The clock struck midnight, and the dim glow of the bedside lamp cast eerie shadows across the room. James lay on his bed, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that had been following him all day. The old house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards, a sound he had grown used to over the years. But tonight, the silence felt different, oppressive, almost watchful. James lived alone in the family house he had inherited. It was a sprawling old structure with narrow hallways and creaky doors, the kind of house that seemed to come alive at night. Though he had always brushed off the occasional strange noises as the house settling or the wind playing tricks, tonight felt heavier, darker. It started around 12:30 a.m. Just as James was about to drift off, he heard Ida faint but distinct sound of footsteps. Slow and deliberate, they seemed to echo from the hallway outside his room. His heart skipped a beat as he sat up, straining his ears to catch the noise. The steps grew louder, closer. They weren't hurried or hesitant, but deliberate, as though whoever was walking knew exactly where they were going. James's first thought was that it had to be an intruder. His hand instinctively reached for the baseball bat he kept under his bed. "Who's there?" he called, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. The footsteps stopped. James held his breath, gripping the bat tightly. The silence that followed was suffocating. He waited, listening intently for any sign of movement, but the house was eerily still. After what felt like an eternity, he mustered the courage to get out of bed. With the bat in one hand and his phone in the other, James stepped into the hallway. The air felt colder out here, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. He scanned the area with his flashlight, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, the sense of being watched was overwhelming. "Maybe I am just imagining things," he muttered to himself, though the doubt lingered. He checked the doors and windows, all of which were locked. Satisfied that no one had broken in, he returned to his room and tried to settle down. But as soon as he lay back down, the footsteps resumed. This time, they sounded even closer, as if someone were walking just outside his door. His pulse quickened as the doorknob rattled lightly, as though someone were testing it. James sat up straight, gripping the bat so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "Whoever you are, I am calling the police," he shouted, his voice breaking slightly. The rattling stopped, and for a moment, there was silence again. But then, a deep, guttural voice came from the other side of the door. It spoke in a language James didn't understand, each word resonating with an unnatural weight that sent chills down his spine. Panic surged through him as he scrambled to dial 911, but before he could hit the call button, the voice stopped, and a deafening bang shook the door. James jumped back, his heart racing as the doorknob began to turn slowly. The lock held, but the sight of it moving on its own was enough to send him into full-blown terror. He began to pray, his voice trembling. "Please, God, protect me. I don't know what's happening, but please keep me safe." As if in response to his prayer, the banging stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was almost louder than the noise had been. James waited, his chest heaving, until he was sure that whatever had been outside his door was gone. The rest of the night passed in a blur of restless fear. James left the lamp on and didn't dare close his eyes. When the first rays of sunlight crept through the window, he finally felt a measure of relief. The daylight seemed to chase away the oppressive atmosphere that had gripped the house. Determined to make sense of what had happened, James decided to investigate. He searched the hallway and the rest of the house, but found no signs of forced entry or anything unusual. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences continued. Objects would move on their own, whispers filled the silence at night, and shadows seemed to flicker just beyond his line of sight. James's nerves were stretched thin, and he found himself jumping at every little noise. One night, as he sat in the living room, trying to distract himself with a movie, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to come from all around him, overlapping voices that spoke in that same strange language. He couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear, angry, menacing, desperate. James reached out to a friend who had some experience with the paranormal. Sarah was a self-proclaimed medium, someone who had spent years studying the supernatural. When he explained what had been happening, she agreed to come over, and when Sarah arrived, she immediately sensed the tension in the house. Here is definitely something here," she said, her voice serious. Something angry. She performed a cleansing ritual, burning sage and chanting softly as she moved through the house. James followed her, clutching a rosary that his grandmother had given him years. As Sarah reached the hallway outside his room, she stopped abruptly. "What is it?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah pointed to a faint set of footprints on the wooden floor. They were large, too large to be human, and they seemed to lead straight to James's bedroom. "Whatever this is, it's attached to you," Sarah said, her tone gray. "You need to face it head on. Pray, meditate, do whatever you can to protect yourself. But you have to let it know that it doesn't have power over." That night, James sat on his bed, the rosary clutched tightly in his hands. He began to pray aloud, pouring all his fear and desperation into his words. The house seemed to react, groaning and creaking as if in protest. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but James didn't. "You have no power here," he said firmly, his voice growing stronger. "I am protected. I am not afraid of." The whispers reached a crescendo, then stopped abruptly. The house fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting as if a storm had passed. For the first time in weeks, James felt a sense of peace. The strange occurrences stopped after that night. The house returned to its usual creaks and groans, and James was finally able to sleep soundly. Though the experience left him shaken, it also strengthened his faith and his. James never found out what had haunted him during those weeks, but he knew one thing for certain: the power of prayer and belief had saved him, and he would never take the silence of his old house for granted.